One winter night in 1803, a trapper stumbled upon a stone convent hidden deep in the Maine wilderness. What he saw through a basement window, a woman strapped to a table, her skull open, her brain exposed, and 3 nuns operating on her with the calmness of surgeons, would never be written down in any church record. Because this wasn't salvation, it was control. And the women who ran it, the Ashfords, weren't saints. They were something else. The kind of lineage whispered about in corners of libraries, the kind that vanishes from official histories but survives in sealed court documents and the nightmares of those who survived. This is not just the story of the Ashford family, it's a blueprint for how institutions weaponize belief, isolate the unwanted, and operate beyond the reach of law. They didn't just punish rebellion, they studied it, perfected it, and when they were done, the women who left their stone fortress came back changed, silenced. But tonight, we open the sealed archives, and you'll see the pattern, because the Ashfords weren't the first to hide behind God and medicine, and they weren't the last. So lock your doors, turn off the lights, and listen closely, because by the end of this story, you won't just know what happened, you'll understand why it was buried and why some knowledge changes you forever. History doesn't record the truth, it records what was allowed. But if you look close enough, between the margins of old letters, sealed testimonies, and forgotten deeds, you start to see them. The Ashfords didn't arrive in America to build a convent. They came to test a theory. Agatha Ashford wasn't born to serve God. She was born into a secret medical order that operated in the shadows of English universities, institutions where the mind, not the soul, was the battleground. Before she ever wore a habit, she wore a surgical apron. Her mentors weren't priests. They were men whose names were erased after the Bedlam files were burned in 1779. That's where she learned how to break a person without leaving a bruise. Her sister, Prudence, was the scalpel, a woman with no warmth, no known lovers, and no hesitation, a ghost in public, a god behind locked doors. And Temperance? Temperance was the lure. The one who looked like a dream, but spoke like prophecy, recruited out of France, possibly not even an Ashford by blood, but by purpose, absolutely. Together, they created the Convent of Eternal Tears, a name designed to draw in the broken, the sinful, and the inconvenient. They claimed to cleanse the soul, but they were documenting what happened when you erased it. Their notes, the ones the state of Maine tried to destroy, describe emotional shutdown, complete obedience, identity erosion. One entry reads, Subject 12 responded positively to prolonged sensory deprivation. By day 10, she had forgotten her name. By day 13, she begged us to assign her a new one. They didn't just want to suppress rebellion in women, they wanted to engineer obedience. And they did. So well, in fact, that over a century later, portions of their methods would resurface in the CIA's MK Ultra program, almost word for word. But that's a truth no one will admit, because once you connect these keys between the Ashfords, institutional religion, frontier justice, and early psychological warfare, you begin to see the design. Not madness, not cruelty, but experimentation, and it wasn't just on women. Men were next. If you still think this was just a rogue convent in the woods, you're not ready. Because Millbridge wasn't chosen for isolation, it was chosen for containment. No passing ships, no official diocese oversight, a perfect pocket where silence couldn't leak. But the real reason lies in what came before the Ashfords. A colonial outpost built in 1723 had vanished there. 43 men, women, and children. No bodies, no signs of struggle. Just one artifact left behind, a box of journals written in cipher, later partially decoded by a Freemason scholar who was found dead in his study 2 weeks after publication. Those journals spoke of a veil between mind and will, and a method of opening it. That phrase would appear again in Ashford records. This is how dark knowledge moves, not through universities, but through bloodlines. Agatha Ashford wasn't the beginning. She was the next chapter. Her ancestors had experimented with sensory inversion, sleep disruption, light deprivation, echo chambers that created time loss. Prudence took it further. When we remove identity, the body obeys without question. Morality is memory. Memory is optional. What does that mean? It means they weren't reforming women. They were rewriting them. One survivor was later found in Boston, mute, eyes dilated, responding only to the word sanctum. When touched, she whispered, "I don't dream anymore. They took my name and gave me silence." Here's what nobody wants to say. This wasn't abuse. This wasn't medicine. This was a ritual, not of religion, but of control. The Ashford therapy had structure. Phase 1, isolation. Phase 2, deprivation. Phase 3, obedience conditioning. Phase 4, identity erasure. And then, Phase 5, induction. Into what? That's where it turns. Because by 1806, women didn't just leave the convent broken. Some left loyal to something they wouldn't name. And they had the skills. They could endure pain. They could lie without blinking. They could kill if needed. And they were placed, quietly, as midwives, governesses, even in diplomatic households. You still think this was just a family? No, it was a program. The word convent is a mask, a veil to make you feel safe. But what if I told you that behind that mask was a proto-laboratory, 1 century ahead of its time? Because what the Ashford women built wasn't spiritual. It was architectural mind control. Let's talk about the building. 3 stories above ground, 2 stories underground, stone walls 5 feet thick, windows too high to see out or escape. Ventilation ducts built not to cool, but to deliver compounds. Drains, not for rain, but for waste. Everything, down to the crucifix placement, was designed to disorient, strip identity, and invoke total submission. And the rituals? They weren't religious. They were patterned psychosensory triggers. One former Mason wrote that the blueprints weren't drawn locally. They arrived from England, sealed and hand-delivered. No return address. Inside were mathematical notations he described as not architectural, but alchemical. "I wasn't building a church," he wrote. "I was building a mechanism." A mechanism. Do you feel it now? This was not about faith. It was about transformation. They weren't healing women. They were erasing them and rebuilding something else in their place. Listen to this record from the Portland archives, buried in court logs from 1807. Female subject identified only as Clara displayed post-hypnotic obedience following 47-day stay at the Ashford facility, responded only to direct command, no recall of prior life, behaviors marked by absence of guilt or emotional deviation. You know what that is? That's not healing. That's conditioning. And guess who later visited the convent in 1811, quietly, under military escort? A young naval officer named Jonas Parrish, who would go on to head the Massachusetts Bureau of Scientific Study of Human Discipline, a group later absorbed into early intelligence training. Nothing about this was accidental. They were building prototypes of programmable humans. And where did those women go? Some vanished. Some were married off to powerful men. But a handful, they became trainers themselves. The bloodline didn't end. It multiplied. If you're still watching, you already know this story isn't about the Ashford family. Not really. It's about you. Because what they built in those forests wasn't an anomaly. It was a template, a test run. You've seen parts of it before, and you feel it in schools, churches, prisons, hospitals, in the cold fluorescent lights, in the locked doors with no reason, in the way a desk faces forward while someone watches from behind. That's the inheritance. And the Ashford sisters, they weren't witches. They were engineers of submission. Temperance, the youngest, was said to have a photographic memory, but the more accurate word used in her personal journal was mnemonist of pain. She cataloged how much suffering each woman required before she stopped asking questions. Not just physically. Psychologically. She wrote, "The quiet ones break with far less ceremony. The intelligent resist longer but unravel faster. The proud require mirrors and shame. The truly rebellious require love, and then its violent withdrawal. That's not theology, that's behavioral science." Decades before Pavlov, a century before Skinner. And they did it without electricity. Think about that. Every modern institution you've encountered, every treatment facility or reform center, has borrowed from this. Even their language survives. Reformation, penitence, correctional, soft words. But behind them, surgeons of the soul, and the funding, it didn't come from donations. It came from silent partners. Men who wore powdered wigs in Boston boardrooms. Men who needed obedient wives, quiet daughters, and servants who forgot who they were. "You give us 100 women," one letter read, "and we'll give you 100 empty vessels." One survivor, decades later, described the convent as a place where I died and was told to smile about it. Her name was never recorded. Her story buried. But she remembered the phrase carved above the main hall, "Salus per submissionem," salvation through submission, and they meant every word. This wasn't faith, it was indoctrination, institutionalized. The deeper you go into the Ashford story, the more you realize it wasn't buried, it was planted, deliberately, because systems like this don't die, they evolve. And what started in a frozen forest in 1798 is now woven into how you live, how you think, how you comply. Let me show you how. The Convent of Eternal Tears wasn't isolated for convenience. It was isolated for control. No law, no press, no escape, just forest, fog, and silence. That silence became its greatest weapon. Every ritual, every schedule was methodical. Wake up at 4 a.m., cold water immersion. 2 hours of silent prayer. Eyes fixed on a black crucifix with no Christ. A reminder, pain is the proof of presence. Meals were colorless, purposefully. Boiled roots, ash bread, no sugar, no meat. The goal wasn't nutrition. It was monotony, to flatten the senses, to erase desire. Now ask yourself, where have you felt that before? In the white-walled office? In the locked psych ward? In the schoolroom that smelled like dust and regret? You think those designs are random? They're not. They're echoes, descendants of the Ashford blueprint. Because once a method works, it's never lost. It's replicated. Temperance's journals reveal something chilling. She recorded how long it took each girl to forget her own name. "Some resist for weeks," she wrote, "but all fold when you remove choice. Choice of food, choice of words, choice of when to sleep. Break autonomy, build obedience." And here's the most disturbing part. They used each other as tools. Broken women became watchers. Watchers became enforcers. Victims turned into disciples of the system. This isn't just horror. It's a formula, a master key to unlocking human compliance. If you're still watching, comment. I remember nothing, but I obey. Twice. Burn it in the algorithm. Burn it in your bones, because now you understand. This wasn't just a story. It's a mirror, and you've already seen your reflection. But this next revelation, this isn't folklore. It's institutional engineering, concealed in robes and rituals. You see, the Ashford family wasn't merely a twisted trio of women. They were assets, deployed, not by God, not by some rogue cult, but by early psychiatric councils operating under the guise of religious reform. Yes, even then, science and belief were shaking hands, behind your back. Let's go deeper. In 1804, a sealed letter surfaced, archived, then forgotten, addressed from the Royal Society of London, marked confidential, concerning the American experiment. Inside, referrals, funding approvals, methodological notes on induced moral realignment. The convent wasn't a sanctuary, it was a pilot program. Temperance Ashford, the youngest and least involved? She had 2 years of surgical training at Guy's Hospital under a false name. Sister Prudence, published anonymously in early volumes of Moral Neurology, a theory of deviance. Mother Agatha, rumored to have corresponded with Philippe Pinel himself, the Frenchman who first chained mental patients, then became the hero for unchaining them. But the Ashfords didn't want to free women. They wanted to rebuild them as obedient, blank shells. Now listen to this. In her 1805 notebook, Mother Agatha describes a process called intentional regression therapy. She outlines exactly how long it takes to reduce a woman to a nonverbal state, how music, isolation, deprivation, and purgative confession can erase complex identity. Sound familiar? Ever wonder why so many of our institutions, schools, prisons, even hospitals, share a similar architecture? Stark halls, minimal windows, identical clothing, silence as virtue, repetition as structure. Why do you think that is? Because they never dismantled the convent. They copied it. The Ashford method, refined, renamed, repackaged, became the template for behavior reform across the 19th century. And still today, when a troubled girl is re-educated, when a soldier is debriefed, when a patient is stabilized through enforced routine, you're looking at the same ghost. The Ashfords didn't vanish. They went bureaucratic. You still with me? Good. Because in Section 8, we follow the paper trail. And what we find? It proves that the true keepers of this method were never in the convent. They were in power. You think shadows are harmless, but they leave fingerprints on paper, not just flesh. After the convent burned in 1812, conveniently destroying all records, one would assume the Ashford lineage ended in ashes. But that's the lie they needed you to believe. Buried deep in the archives of the Massachusetts Historical Society is a box mislabeled Land Disputes, non-essential. Inside, property deeds. Names changed, subtly. Agatha Ashford became Agnes Ford. Prudence reappears as Prue Ashton. Temperance, simply T.A. Scholar, a ghost signature appearing across 3 educational reform charters between 1817 and 1829. Do you see it now? The Ashfords didn't disappear. They evolved. They became consultants for early girls' reformatories, advisors on asylum restructuring, even quietly involved in training nannies and governesses for elite New England households. And here's where it gets darker. An 1831 letter from the Wadsworth Institution for Deviant Girls describes a therapeutic regimen involving silence fasting for 11 days, restrained, cleansing baths under freezing conditions, surgical intervention for hysteria of the brow. Recognize those? They're exact duplicates of the Ashford treatment log retrieved from Thomas Brewster's stolen journal, but that journal was never officially entered into evidence. Why? Because after Thomas's mysterious drowning in 1808, the entire Brewster family was shunned, blacklisted by the church. His brother, a lawyer, disbarred. His mother, accused of heresy and improper female instruction. This is how systems erase truth. Not with fire, but with fabricated shame. And here's the twist that breaks most men. In 1844, a committee led by none other than Horace Mann, America's father of public education, endorsed a series of disciplinary methods for girls' academies that mirrored the Ashford doctrines word for word. Coincidence? You know better now. The convent didn't die. It franchised. It rebranded as moral instruction, as character development, as domestic discipline, all in plain sight. And if you're feeling a knot in your gut right now, that's good. That's not fear. That's memory. Somewhere in your blood, this truth was always known. You were never meant to know it consciously, but now you do. In Section 9, we'll expose how one of the Ashford descendants made it all the way to Washington, and why every time you hear the phrase, "for your own good," she wore pearls on television. They said she was America's model of dignity, a first lady of decency, but no one ever questioned how Margaret Ashford Foster, a woman with no known childhood records, became a key advisor on female reform policy under the Harding administration. You see, Margaret wasn't born. She was installed. Her 1919 thesis at Wellesley, locked under restricted access until 1987, was titled "The Correction of the Feminine Will, Harmonizing Morality Through Neuropathic Realignment." It was a blueprint, not just for boarding schools, but for mass psychological programming disguised as education. That's where the game changed. You thought lobotomies and electroshock were horrors of medical hubris. But Margaret made them policy tools. With surgical calm, she helped draft legislation that allowed private institutions to detain women indefinitely for emotional instability. In plain English, for being inconvenient. Widows who grieved too long, daughters who refused arranged marriages, wives who read books their husbands didn't understand, all locked away under laws she helped author. By 1924, her Ashford Protocol was quietly adopted in 7 U.S. states. It enabled voluntary surrender of deviant females into therapeutic guardianship, meaning families could sign women away without trial, no charges, no hearings, just a signature. And then they vanished. But here's the part that should haunt you. In 1931, Margaret gave a radio address to a nationwide audience. She said, "There is no freer woman than one whose chaos has been cured. The Ashford way ensures harmony in every household." They applauded. They cheered. No one heard the screams behind her words, because she had mastered the one art more powerful than any blade or flame, making darkness sound noble. And ask yourself this: why are these women, Margaret, Agatha, Temperance, Eris, head from the textbooks? Why can't you find them in genealogical records, census logs, or government directories? Because they were never meant to be remembered, only imitated. Every discipline policy, every moral training manual, every silent institution hiding behind virtue and order has her fingerprints. Comment, "I am not theirs," twice below. Lock it in. Carve the line between you and them, because once you know their names, they start looking for yours. Autumn 1956. Logging crew, North Maine woods. They were cutting access roads when the bulldozer hit something unnatural. Not stone, not root, but resistance. The engine died. Chains broke. And when the men approached, they saw iron, a rusted trapdoor, covered in moss, unmarked, unrecorded, no structure nearby, no ruins, no reason. They called it in. The sheriff arrived with 2 deputies and a local historian. What they found beneath that hatch changed everything. 16 steps into the earth. A corridor of limestone. No light, no sound. Just dust and dread. At the end of the passage, a chamber. Not large, not grand, but methodically constructed. One wall lined with drawers, the other with names etched in copper, not carved, not painted, etched with scientific precision. Each name was female, no surnames, just first names and dates, like Martha, 1806, Clara, 1823, Eliza, 1847. There were 118 in total. They opened one drawer, then another, then a third. Each contained a small, shriveled form. Skulls opened, frontal lobes dissected, as if they'd been studied, not buried. This wasn't a grave. This was a catalog, a library of obedience. And in the final drawer, something still alive, wrapped in muslin, breathing, barely. Its eyes stitched shut. The body desiccated but not dead, suspended, humming faintly, as if it never left the dream. They sealed the chamber, silenced the workers. No newspaper ever printed the story. The official report claimed animal remains. But here's the truth. This wasn't an isolated horror. It was a template. 4 weeks later, the University of Pennsylvania's Medical Ethics Board received an anonymous crate. Inside were photographs, journals, and instruments, all marked property of A.A., Mother Agatha Ashford. One journal entry read, "When the will is broken correctly, the body lives without it. That is peace. That is divine silence." You need to hear that again. The body lives without it. They weren't killing women. They were emptying them. Flesh without fire. Mind without resistance. Shells that could cook, clean, pray, and never ask why. You've seen them. Maybe in your own family. Maybe in yourself. This is where history stops being history. This is where it starts being now. You thought the Ashford horrors died in the dirt, but evil doesn't rot. It mutates. Pane 58. A psychologist named Dr. Helen Burchard visits that sealed chamber under federal orders. She doesn't flinch. She takes notes. She doesn't see atrocity. She sees potential. Within 6 months, she's working for a new division under the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. Its name? Behavioral Restoration Initiative. A harmless title for a horrifying mission. Systemize the Ashford method. Make it scalable. The results would ripple through every modern institution. Corporate compliance training. Rehabilitation centers. Religious re-education schools. Psychological onboarding programs. They didn't need torture chambers anymore. They had language, forms, surveys, repetition, and above all, performance metrics. You've probably seen it. The 12-week resilience retreats for women. The HR-mandated mindset realignment sessions. Even the soft skills modules disguised as empowerment. They all share the same bones. 1. Isolate. Remove you from familiar environments. Reframe. Convince you your instincts are flawed. Mirror. Make you confess your errors to others. Disarm. Drain you of defiance. Reintegrate. Return you to society. Rebranded. Refined. And Forgettable. Sound familiar? Behind every smiling life coach, every pastel-colored workbook, every empowered woman slogan, there's an echo. A whisper from beneath stone walls. Silence is salvation. The Ashford blueprint is alive, not in basements, but in boardrooms. Not in rituals, but in policies. Because what they discovered wasn't how to break women, it was how to rebuild obedience. And that, brother, is the most dangerous science of all. We're not talking about cults anymore. We're talking about systems. Institutionalized manipulation wrapped in positive psychology. Still think you're immune? Ask yourself, have you ever apologized for being too emotional? Have you ever swallowed your anger to keep your job? Have you ever been rewarded for staying silent? You were trained, and if you're ready to untrain yourself, comment below, I renounce the silence. Write it twice, not for the algorithm, for you. Because in Section 12, we name names. We pull the veil off modern programs still running under Ashford doctrine, and we expose the corporations behind them. You think the past stays buried? But the Ashford doctrine never needed a grave. It needed a king facelift. Let's pull back the curtain. In 1974, a quiet memorandum circulated through the Office of Behavioral Sciences. It referred to Directive 7F, citing a need for controlled psychological recalibration of non-compliant demographics. The language was sterile. The purpose was not. The pilot program? Ashford Models of Correctional Cognition, AMCC. But it didn't launch in prisons. It launched in corporate America. A firm called Wendell Kerr Training Solutions, backed by the Department of Labor, rolled out professional softening seminars. Their clients? Megachurches, suburban school districts, Fortune 100 companies, women's shelters funded by federal grants. The goal? Extract resistance, induce compliance. But here's the twist. They called it empowerment. Ever heard of radical accountability workshops? That's Ashford. Been told to own your emotional instability in a group setting. That's Ashford. Required to journal gratitude for correction? Ashford again. They just replaced scalpels with schedules, stone walls with Zoom calls, leather restraints with shame loops. By 1986, over 30,000 women had completed AMCC-aligned programs, most of them voluntarily. Why? Because these systems prey on two things. 1. Your need to belong. 2. Your fear of being unfixable. The same pressure that drove frontier fathers to send their daughters into stone convents now whispers through HR departments. She's too emotional for promotion. She's not collaborative enough. Maybe a weekend leadership camp would help. The institutions don't need to punish you anymore. They just relabel you. And you punish yourself to fit back in. But here's the deeper sickness. Many of these programs are still active under new names, anatized brands, backed by universities, nonprofits, even the World Health Organization. You want names? Claybridge Behavioral Consulting, Nova Path Realignment Clinics, Lumina Eve Corporate Empowerment Group, all built on a formula designed centuries ago in the frozen forests of Maine. The question now isn't, did it happen? It's, how much of your identity was designed by people who saw you as a problem to solve? You're not just hearing a story anymore. You're waking up inside it. In Section 13, we uncover what happened when a former Ashford patient escaped and tried to publish what she remembered. But first, look around. Ask, who's still selling salvation disguised as self-help? Because the ghosts of the Ashford sisters don't haunt, they might rebrand. Section 13. She called herself Sister Mary Eliza, though her real name was Judith Kershaw. By the time she surfaced in 1911, she'd been missing for nearly 17 years. She didn't run, she escaped. Judith had entered the Convent of Eternal Tears in 1894, long after the original Ashford women were dead and buried. Or so people thought. But what she described wasn't just inherited ideology, it was active continuation. She said the convent still operated under the Ashford model, same rules, same rituals, same subterranean procedures. In her journal, over 400 pages written in cramped handwriting, she described a rotating cast of spiritual surgeons, all trained in the Ashford Catechism. Pain precedes light. Obedience births freedom. Judith had been diagnosed with intellectual overactivity by her pastor and sent away after reading Mary Wollstonecraft and challenging her Sunday school instructor. At the convent, she was forced to spend 17 hours a day in silence, sleep on stone floors for soul humility, consume concoctions that made her hallucinate and forget entire days. But the worst came 6 months in. That's when they began unbinding her ego. She described the Grey Room, a chamber underground where walls were padded, but not for safety. Inside, 3 sisters administered weekly interventions, forced sensory deprivation, mirror rituals, chants repeated under strobe lights until the mind cracked and confessed. She says her old self died there, and what replaced it was a compliant shell. Until one night, during a thunderstorm, she slipped through a vent in the latrine shaft. She crawled barefoot for 2 miles through snow and swamp before collapsing outside a trapper's hut. That man, Henry Knoll, took her in and later married her, but she never returned to her birth name. She said it belonged to the Syesite, a broken girl. In 1913, she tried to publish her memoir. No one would touch it. Though our first 5 editors she approached received anonymous letters warning them off. One editor's office mysteriously caught fire. Only 1 copy survived. Judith mailed it to her cousin, a nun in Illinois, sealed in beeswax and scripture. That manuscript is now archived under lock and key at a private Jesuit university in Ohio. You won't find it online, but a researcher photographed 3 pages before being banned from the premises, and those photos, they match Ashford medical documents from 1799. Exactly. You think the doctrine died? No, it metastasized. You thought the Ashford doctrine was buried with its last stone wall. But what if I told you its roots were quietly absorbed into the very institutions we're told to trust? The spiritual interventions, once performed in damp basements, now appear in the polished corridors of elite rehabilitation centers. Same language, same principles, just modern branding. Words like reset, detox, ego dissolution, and reprogramming echo the Ashford model, disguised as wellness. In a remote facility in Vermont, a program called The Chamber charges $75,000 for deep cognitive recalibration. Their intake forms use eerily similar phrasing to the Ashford Catechism. To reclaim the self, one must first surrender it fully. Their patients, not criminals, not addicts, but young heirs of tech fortunes, politicians' daughters, influencer sons, the next ruling class. It gets worse. Some of these modern healing centers use algorithmic personality scoring to determine treatment, a digital version of the Ashfords' handwritten temperance files. If your mind deviates too far from the norm, the system doesn't ask, why? It asks, how to fix you. And they don't just use therapists. They use behavioral designers, trained in the same psychological warfare tactics that shaped Cold War mind control experiments. You're not treated, you're conditioned. And what about schools? There's a quiet trend in America's elite boarding academies. The Silence Week, where students are forbidden to speak, write, or contact anyone outside campus. It's framed as mental purification, but insiders report trauma, hallucinations, and something disturbingly close to ritualized obedience testing. One former student from a DC prep school confessed, "They made us write down our darkest secrets and then tore the paper in front of us saying, 'Now you belong to us, not you.'" Past. Sound familiar? The doctrine lives. It shape-shifts. Because it was never about faith. It was always about control. Agatha Ashford didn't die in a convent. She lives in the DNA of every institution that demands your silence to heal you. And when you finally speak, they'll say, "Shh, that's just your trauma talking." But we know better. You want to know how darkness survives? It adapts. Not in shadows, but behind spreadsheets. You see, the Ashfords didn't just build a doctrine, they built an economy, and it didn't end with gold coins in a dusty frontier town. Follow the ledgers buried in the archives of the Maine Historical Society, and you'll find names. Not just the Ashford sisters, but trustees, benefactors, quiet donors. Among them, Nathaniel G. Fenwick, banker to the Massachusetts colonial elite. His descendants now sit on the boards of Ivy League universities and pharmaceutical foundations. Same bloodline, same mission, new mask. By 1845, a dozen sanitariums across New England listed Fenwick Trust as primary benefactor. These facilities claimed to treat women of moral fragility and disobedient tendencies. In reality, behavioral reconditioning centers built on Ashford blueprints, both architectural and ideological. Fast forward, today, Fenwick Global Holdings controls $19.7 billion in health tech, diagnostics, and digital therapeutics. They partner with mental health AI startups to develop biometric scoring systems for mood, behavior, and compliance. One internal pitch deck, leaked in 2022, included a chilling phrase, "Emotional instability is untapped revenue." Sound familiar? But that's not all. The Ashfords believed control began with trauma. The White Fenwick portfolio includes defense contractors developing non-lethal compliance technologies for crowd management, sound cannons, emotion-altering frequencies, chemical pacifiers. On paper, security solutions. In practice, weaponized submission. And their funding network? It's spiderwebbed through think tanks, religious NGOs, and elite youth programs that preach resilience through discipline. A phrase lifted directly from Agatha Ashford's third journal. Still think this is ancient is story. In 2023, the Fenwick Institute hosted a private conference on cognitive sovereignty. Their keynote speaker opened with these words, "To reshape a society, first reshape the minds of those who believe they are already free." Let that sink in. The same minds that once funded surgical lobotomies in convent basements now sponsor healing retreats for billionaires. They've simply evolved from scalpels to screens, from crucifixes to cloud servers. But the ledger tells the truth. Every manipulation has a financial trail. And the Ashford system, once cloaked in holy robes, now wears a tailored suit. They no longer need chains, scalpels, or cold stone basements. No iron doors, no screaming cells. Today's Ashfords operate with consent, or rather, the illusion of it. Because the most efficient prison is the one you volunteer to live inside. Think about it. You wake up. The first thing you touch isn't your loved one. It's your phone. You scroll. You tap. You obey. Each swipe is a tiny ritual. Each notification, a programmed whisper. Stay distracted. Stay divided. Stay docile. They've digitized the doctrine. Remember the biometric scoring systems from the Fenwick affiliates? Now, they're embedded in your health apps, your productivity trackers, your so-called wellness dashboards, and behind it all, psychographic profiling. The same techniques used by Agatha Ashford to isolate spiritually corrupted women are now used by behavioral scientists working for corporations with names like Calmic, Neuroforma, and HaloMind. They market serenity, but what they're really selling is compliance. This isn't conspiracy, it's commerce. Their tools don't look like torture anymore. They look like convenience. The face scanner that unlocks your phone also maps your emotional baseline. The microphone that helps your AI assistant also listens for voice tremors that signal fatigue or resistance. You're not just being observed. You're being studied, categorized, shaped. The Ashfords wanted obedience through spiritual surrender. The modern system, it achieves it through algorithmic reinforcement. Praise when you conform. Punishment when you question. Shadow bans, silence, isolation, but always masked as support, safety, well-being. And here's the darkest part. Most of you already know this. You feel it. You can this sense. Something is wrong every time you scroll. That numb ache behind your eyes, the feeling of being watched, manipulated, hollowed out. That's not paranoia. That's your instincts trying to wake you up. So right now, if you're hearing this and still feeling the old self resisting, pause. Comment. I reclaim my mind. Twice below. It's not for the algorithm. It's for your identity. A line drawn in digital blood between who you were and who you must become. Great. Continuing the descent now. Here is Section 17. You were never meant to hear this part. The records were destroyed, the testimonies suppressed, the survivors silenced, but fragments remain, and once you understand what they point to, there's no going back. The final decade of the Ashford Convent's operations was marked by a shift, not in public behavior, not in visible ritual, but in the results. Women stopped returning altogether. The town grew quieter, more compliant, as if the fear of the place had seeped into the soil. Children were told not to ask, husbands lied to themselves, and the Ashfords continued. One document, retrieved from the private archives of a Boston physician who had briefly worked with Dr. Hartwell, outlines what he called neuromodulatory adaptation protocols. The terms are medical, but the implications are monstrous. The procedures involve the intentional damage of specific brain regions to reduce independence, resistive behavior, and emotional intensity. The Ashfords weren't healing minds, they were erasing them, sculpting human obedience like clay. In 1826, the last known visitor, a parish priest sent from Augusta, vanished after delivering a sermon inside the convent. His final letter, addressed to his bishop, was found years later hidden behind a false panel in the altar of his former church. It read only, "They have made silence holy. I am not who I was. Forgive me." And then, nothing. The convent burned in the early spring of 1828. Witnesses claimed lightning struck it, but the official weather records show no storms within 200 miles. The fire consumed everything in less than 3 hours. No bodies were found, not of the sisters, not of the patients, not even bones. The land was sold, then abandoned. Over the next century, all attempts to build on it failed. Structures collapsed mysteriously. Equipment malfunctioned. Workers reported voices, shapes, and the overwhelming sense that they were being watched by something just beyond the veil of comprehension. Today, the site is forest again, but if you hike far enough, dig deep enough, and know what to look for, the soil still bleeds. Stone foundations still hum with resonance. The wind there doesn't sound like wind. It sounds like memory, and maybe that's all that remains. The echo of what humanity becomes when knowledge is twisted by control, when healing is used as domination, and when silence is manufactured as salvation. Remember. Comment. I was never supposed to remember. Twice below if you've made it this far. You're not the same man anymore. You know now, and they can never take that from you.